whatever you want to say. But when I came here and they explained to me that Jesus died for my sins and for me to go to heaven, to be with God, how could I ever feel like I'm not enough? The moment I was saved, I felt that love for the first time in a long time. We're learning to love each other now, and learning to love God and learning to love ourselves, and bringing that all together to create something very special.
We're really all still fighting the same fight. So it's nice to be around people that you can completely relate to on the hard stuff, the stuff that you don't want to tell people.
You build a support system so that when you leave, you're not alone.
I mean, you can't come here and not believe that there is something bigger and greater.
The hope and the salvation that Christ brings can save any marriage, and that it's not ever too late and it's not ever too far gone, because if it can save ours, it can save any marriage.
Stand and join us as we sing Wonderful, Merciful Savior.
I invite you all to turn in your Bibles to the book of Esther, chapter 6, today verses 1 through 11. That night, the king could not sleep, so he ordered the book of Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. It was found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this? The king asked. Nothing has been done for him, his attendants answered. The king said, Who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the palace to speak to the king about what should be done for the man the king delights to honor. Now Haman thought to himself, Who is there that the king would rather honor than me? So he answered the king, For the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Go at once, the king commanded. Haman, get the robe and the horse and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended. So Haman got the robe and the horse. He robed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Well, on a day like today, where it's nice, it's a bit warm, but I like to fish on a day like today sometimes. I like getting outside, enjoying the weather, being by the river or a lake or wherever it is, and just having time to relax. However, a problem comes in because I am not a very good fisherman. I frequently get my line tangled up and I have to tug and I often break and lose my hook, and I seem to constantly lose my worm or whatever I'm using for bait, and rarely, if ever, do I catch anything. You know, if I'm honest, a lot of times when I go out, I honestly think and I have little faith in myself and don't really plan to catch anything. So often, in fact, that I don't even oftentimes bring a bucket or a line to store my fish on or anything that I would be able to keep fish on in the chance that I would have a successful day. I don't really take the time and trust that maybe God on this day will bless me with the right opportunity for a successful catch. I certainly don't have much faith in my own abilities to fish. And so I'm usually not prepared. I don't prepare myself properly for what could be a successful day. And I think sometimes we get that way with God as well. Maybe we bring a prayer request to Him. Maybe there's something on our heart that we know we need to bring before God. But do we truly prepare ourselves for whatever it is that God has in store when we bring those prayers before Him? When we ask God to act, we must have the faith and the trust to truly believe that God will act, and God does act in mighty ways, and we must prepare our hearts, our minds to do those things. And that's where we pick up Esther's story today. As Esther, if you were here last week or listened to the message, you heard Esther was called to do a mighty thing. She was called to recognize that she was the only person that could act to save her people. And even though she's reluctant, she ultimately recognizes that she is here for this purpose. She must act, and she must prepare herself, her own heart, her own mind, as well as call upon all of her people to be prepared as well. You know, by this time in the story, the Jews of the kingdom it's been declared that they are to be executed. This happened because Mordecai, Esther's uncle, who raised her, was strong in his faith, and he refused to bow down to Haman, the king's nobleman, and treat him like a god. So, to stop this execution, as I said, Mordecai has gone to Esther, and ask, please go before the king, your husband, and ask him to spare the lives of the Jewish people in the community. Initially, she's reluctant, knowing that anyone that goes before the king is executed unless he's having a good day and on a whim decides to spare their life. But she has come to the understanding, she can see her position and her place and recognize that she is the only person in this moment that can save her people. So she recognizes that, she accepts her position and she goes to do that. But before she does that, she calls the people to prepare. She says, okay, if you want me to do this, great. Spend some time fasting. Turn your hearts to prayer and focus on God so that you are ready, so that you are truly behind me as I go to act. Esther recognizes that she can accomplish these mighty things if she truly goes before the king, knowing that God will act, and if she has a right heart. So she gets herself ready. She calls on the people to be ready, to help prepare, to trust that God will move in mighty ways. When we ask God to do something, do we truly do that? You know, when we want a mighty miracle, when we look at our world and ask God to act in mighty ways, do we truly prepare ourselves, recognize that God can and does move in mighty and amazing ways? Or do we look at our request and say, well, probably not going to happen, or God maybe is going to remain silent? You know, are there times where we look at somebody who is very ill and we ask God for prayers of healing? Do we truly believe that will happen? Or do we think that there's just no possible way? You know, let's recognize, obviously, God doesn't always answer prayers in the way we want, which is probably a good thing, because God knows greater than us, and God certainly doesn't just grant us every wish, but God grants prayer. He answers each and every prayer. It doesn't mean it will be answered in the way we want or how we think, but God is always acting and moving, as we will see as we continue to look through the text for today. You know, my hope and my prayer was last week, if you were here, you know, you were stirred to things, you know, and maybe some of the things that we talked about or looked at spurred you to take some action and to begin thinking about what does God have for you to do with all that is going on in the world. What is your place in that? And I hope we can all recognize that we have a place, much like Esther, that we each have unique and special gifts and things that only we can accomplish for God. But my other prayer is that you haven't just been spurred to something and jumped into something overly impulsively or foolishly and decided you're going to sell everything and move to Africa or whatever. My hope is that as things stir in you, you do what Esther did, and you truly prepare your heart to act within the will of God in all things, and truly do and act as God would have you do. To prepare your heart and soul just as Esther did, knowing that you have a purpose, that God wants mighty things from you and will be with you each and every step of the way. As we continue on, just before the text we read earlier, Esther is now prepared. She goes before the king, and the king shows his approval to Esther, his queen. You know, she'd kind of fallen out of favor for a while, hadn't seen her husband for a month, but she goes before him, and he has a renewed interest in her. And he promises her anything she wants, even up to half of the entire kingdom. So Esther then requests to have a banquet. She wants a banquet put on, and when she gets to that banquet, Esther requests another banquet to make her big request. So as I looked and I studied the text for today, I thought maybe Esther truly it was one of the very first Baptists, because she set up this big elaborate meal just to set up and have another big elaborate meal, right? So, but she sets up this special banquet. This special banquet is just for her, the king, and Haman. And Haman is the one who has declared to have all the Jews executed. So Haman hears that he is invited to this extra special banquet with just the king and the queen, and he uses that as an opportunity to continue to bolster himself, to brag about how great he is. Look at what I'm invited to, and none of you other people are, right? So he's kind of strutting around, feeling pretty proud of himself, until he runs into Mordecai again. Mordecai is that guy who has already upset him. He's the person who upset Haman and has put all these events into place. And Mordecai again refuses to bow down. Haman then is all upset, but he keeps himself restrained. Rather than lashing out at Mordecai in that moment, he goes and he just kind of vents to his wife, and he says, "Can you believe this guy is still doing this, even when I'm plotting and planning to wipe out all his people?" His wife says, "Well, just be done with him. Let's go build a gallows, have the guy hung tomorrow morning, and be done with him." So he does that. He sets up the gallows. He has it built, and then he goes to the king to go get permission. Now, while all that's going on, Esther is preparing her heart and her mind for this mighty task that she has before us, as Haman is plotting and even physically having the gallows built that is going to execute Mordecai and begin the assassination of all the people. King Xerxes, he's in his chamber having a sleepless night. That's where we begin the text for today. The king Xerxes is not able to sleep. He cannot find rest. You know, we don't have any details on what's going on that's causing him that sleepless night. But as you look at the big picture, you look at all these remarkable coincidences and things that are going on, you can see that God is truly in charge of it. You can almost picture kind of the angel smacking Xerxes on the side of the head and keeping him awake, as we see all these remarkable coincidences playing out. So Esther is preparing herself and has gone before the king to set things up. Haman is at a place where he is putting his evil plans to fruition, but then Xerxes is here, not able to sleep, which is going to change the course of all these other events that are going on. As Xerxes is unable to sleep, like many of us want to do, he requests to be read a bedtime story, right? And he wants to be read a bedtime story from what they call the Book of Chronicles, which was kind of a rundown of all the recent events going on in the kingdom. He wants to hear about everything that's going on, all the greatness of the power and the glory of his kingdom. And as another marvelous coincidence pops up, the person who comes to read to the king comes to that exact place and recalls how Mordecai had previously saved his life. So at the very moment where gallows are being erected to execute Mordecai, the king is being reminded of how this man has saved his life. We see that God is always working, even though we can't always see it, we can't always understand it. God is always working in our world. In all the events, God is working, and we can trust and have faith as we will continue to see the story played out, that God's greatness and glory shines through. As the king is reminded of Mordecai's good deed which saved his life, he recalls this life-saving deed at the exact same moment when events are being set in place to conspire against all of God's specially chosen people. We can remember that when we too are going through hard times, times when life seems hopeless, God knows what you are going through. God knows what needs to be done and will act, because God is always at work. We can't always see that in the midst of darkness, but God is always working for the good of his people. So we have faith and remember that he will act in the right and proper time. So as the king's been reminded of Mordecai's great actions, he comes to the realization that, hey, I never did anything for this guy. He saved my life, and I then went and set up and just made sure I was safe and secure so nothing like this could happen again. He realizes he's dropped the ball in doing anything for this person who saved his life. It's something that the king wants to set right. So he begins to think and ask of ways that he can repay this man. And that's when we see the fortune of the Jewish people begin to change. What was once hopeless is now beginning to turn around. But as these remarkable coincidences are happening, Haman is coming to the king at that exact moment to say, hey, I want to have somebody executed. At the exact time King Xerxes is being reminded of how his life was saved by Mordecai, there is one plotting death against him. These two powerful men are working in very different ways, but God's glory continues to shine through. So as the king hears that Haman is coming to the court, even though it's late, he says, bring him on in. He wants to maybe confer with this guy. He knows that he's a wise friend of his and will have good advice. So he asks, what should we do for this person? This trusted advisor comes and says, the king asks, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? We see that Haman, of course, is very arrogant, and that quickly shows through. He figures, hey, there's nobody else in the kingdom that could possibly deserve the king's honor but me, right? Of course, he's asking about how he wants to honor me, because I'm so great above all else. These guys, they're not using names or anything, but they both have clear agendas. They think they're really connecting, but they could not be farther apart with their intentions. Their conflicting attentions are coming together through all these remarkable coincidences. So as Haman in his arrogance, he sees his opportunity. He decides, hey, I can get things really set up for myself now. He wants all the greatest honors. He could have all the riches of the kingdom. He could have land. Maybe he could even be granted a whole part of the kingdom to rule for himself. But his greatest desire is to truly be treated as he was the king. So Haman sets things up to get everything he wants. He wants to receive all the finest honors. So he says, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn and a horse the king has ridden. One with the royal crest placed upon its head. The very greatest honor anyone could receive at that time was to wear something that the king had worn, to wear his robe, to be able to ride in on the king's horse. Haman truly wants to be treated as a king. Maybe even to pretend for at least a few moments he was the king. You remember a few weeks back, and I've talked off and on about I grew up in the world of politics, and state capitol was my playground growing up. And one of the coolest things I got to do was sit right at the governor's desk. And it wasn't the pretend desk of the governor's that's in kind of his outer office where he greets people and takes pictures. I got to go into the real office where he actually does work and sit at his desk and pretend for a few minutes that I was the governor, that I was this great person of power and authority. And that's what Haman is trying to do here. He wants to be treated, he wants to feel, he wants to pretend that he truly is the king. And so he's getting everything set up to receive all those great honor, all that glory, and be equal to the king. He tells him, give this person you desire to honor all these great things. All praise should go to this man the king's desires to honor. The arrogance of Haman stops him from even considering there could possibly be anyone else out there the king would want to honor until he realizes things are not quite going the way he thought. As the king says, go at once. Get the robe and the horse and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended. He says, go do all these great things that you want done for this person who is your mortal enemy. Go do this for the person that a gallows you had built and were planning to execute in just a few short hours. The king even says, don't neglect anything. Do each and everything you suggested. He doesn't tell him to go have some servants do it or anybody else. He says, you need to get this done. Every desire of Haman's heart is to be given to the one man he wants dead. Mordecai saved the king's life, and now the king has saved his life without even knowing about it. Not only is he saved from death, but he is to receive great public honor. And not only will he receive great public honor, but he's going to receive that honor from his greatest enemy, the one person who sought to have him put to death and destroyed and wipe out all of his people, is the one who has to come up and say, this is what is done for the man the king delights to glory. As Mordecai is dressed as the king, riding on the horse and receiving praise and glory. As Haman's greatest desires are given to this man he burns with rage against. Haman is publicly humiliated as everybody would have known who the gallows was being built for. And it begins